Ready for a deep dive? Let's journey into Israeli cinema and see how women have been portrayed on screen.
Sounds fascinating.
We've got some great sources to work with, academic papers, lecture notes, even a study guide.
Oh, wow.
All in Hebrew, too.
That's going to be interesting to see how those portrayals have changed, alongside the social and political landscape of Israel itself.
Okay, let's rewind back to the early years of Israeli cinema. What were things like back then?
Well, early Israeli cinema, it was really tied to that whole idea of creating a new nation.
Makes sense.
So the dominant perspective back then, it was very masculine, heavily influenced by the military and Zionist ideals of the time.
So I'm guessing not many romantic comedies or family dramas.
Not exactly. One of the sources uses this phrase, and I'll say it in Hebrew first.
I don't speak Hebrew, unfortunately.
It means a masculine, militaristic, and at times even chauvinistic system of values.
Wow. That's pretty direct. I wonder how those films would go over with audiences today.
Right. It was a time of nation building, That pioneering spirit was at its peak.
Yeah, I can see that.
And the myth of the Sabra, the tough, self-reliant Israeli, was front and center. Feminist perspectives, well, they weren't really considered essential to that narrative.
So almost like those early films were a kind of propaganda, reinforcing a very specific vision of what it meant to be Israeli.
There's definitely an element of that, yeah. Filmmaking, especially in a newly formed nation, it was often seen as this tool, for shaping national identity.
But even in those early days, there were filmmakers who kind of pushed back against those norms, right?
Oh, absolutely. Moshe Mizrahi, for example.
Oh, yeah.
His film, I Love You, Rosa, tackled some complex social issues, related to gender roles, which was pretty groundbreaking for its time.
And what about Michal Bat-Adam?
Bat-Adam.
One of the first female directors in Israeli cinema, right?
Yes. Her film, On a Tightrope, offered a completely different perspective on women's lives.
Oh, I can imagine.
Her work is so fascinating. She was a pioneer, really, focusing on female subjectivity, giving us a glimpse into the inner lives and experiences of women in a way that hadn't been seen before.
So even in that more, rigid cinematic landscape, there were these seeds of change being planted.
Right. And as we move into the 1970s, those seeds begin to sprout in really interesting ways.
Ah, the 1970s, the new wave of Israeli cinema. What was it about that decade that was so different?
Well, think about it. Israeli society was becoming more aware of social and political issues.
Okay, yeah.
Traditional values were being questioned, and there was this growing influence of Western thought.
So the films started to reflect all of that.
Exactly. New wave filmmakers weren't afraid to tackle controversial topics, to explore individual complexities, and to present both men and women in a more, I'd say, nuanced light.
What kinds of characters were audiences seeing? The ones they hadn't seen before?
Well, Ella Shohat, a film scholar, she's written a lot about this period. She notes how these films often centered on characters who were more sensitive, more vulnerable, and psychologically complex than the Sabra archetype.
It must have been quite a shift for audiences.
Right. It showed a society becoming less focused on those external threats and more interested in internal struggles, relationships, the complexities of individual identity, all that.
The sources also talk about this evolution. How Israeli cinema, how it became more experimental, pushing the boundaries of storytelling, like from the 1960s through the 1990s.
Yeah, it was a really dynamic period. Israel, during those decades, think about it. It was becoming more liberal, more urbanized, and definitely more influenced by Western culture. The films, they began to reflect all of that.
So it was like how the stories were being told. It was just as important as the stories themselves.
Exactly. They started using innovative visual language, more complex narratives, and all these different cinematic techniques to really draw the audience in and make them connect with the characters on a deeper level.
It's funny thinking about this era. It brings back memories of my first experiences with Israeli cinema. The films felt so real, so raw. It was like getting a glimpse into the heart of a culture grappling with change.
That's the power of film. It's not just about passive watching. It's about actively engaging with a culture. Its nuances, its complexities. It's a window into another world.
And speaking of windows, it feels like a huge one opened when women filmmakers really started to make their mark on Israeli cinema.
Oh, absolutely. That's a major turning point for sure. The sources describe it as a resurgence. Like a wave of creative energy from women directors reshaping how women are portrayed and, who gets to tell their stories.
It wasn't just a coincidence, though, right? These filmmakers had a purpose, a vision for how they wanted to change things.
One quote really captures that intention. I'll share it in Hebrew first. Kifye, kishe, held drum. Murada, festa, kanse, gatsak, lojan, said him. Olbade, kis, maikade, loche, kokade, nene, hey, kish. Good's here. Okay, I'm guessing that's pretty powerful, even if I don't understand Hebrew. What does it say?
It means a new generation of women filmmakers marks the renewed revival of women's cinema in Israel, seeking to redefine the conditions for the representation of women in Israeli society in their films.
Wow, they weren't messing around. So we're talking about a real qualitative shift in representation here.
Absolutely. It was about more than just, increasing the number of women on screen. It was about fundamentally changing how they were seen and understood, showcasing a wider range of perspectives and experiences.
Give us some names, some films to watch out for from this new generation of filmmakers. Of course. Well, Michal Bat Adam continued to be a force. But you also have filmmakers like Julie Schlaz, whose film The Highway is a really compelling exploration of female desire and agency.
Oh, interesting.
And Karen Yedaya, her film, or My Treasure, won the Camera d'Or at Cannes. Just a few examples, but they give you a sense of the breadth and depth of this movement.
Definitely adding those to my watch list. And it's all happening as feminist film theory is gaining traction worldwide. I wonder, what were some of the key ideas that were influencing these filmmakers?
That's a great point. The sources highlight 3 influential feminist film theorists: Claire Johnston, Laura Mulvey, and Teresa de Lauretis.
Okay.
Each of them offers this unique perspective on how women are portrayed in film and what needs to change.
Let's break those down. What were their main contributions?
Well, Claire Johnston, she critiqued those traditional male-dominated narrative structures in cinema.
Right.
And how they perpetuate stereotypes about women.
So she was looking at who gets to tell the stories and how that shapes what we see.
Exactly. Then you have Laura Mulvey, who's famous for her theory of the male gaze. It's the idea that traditional cinema is structured to please a male viewer, often reducing women to objects to be looked at rather than individuals with their own agency.
Wow, that really makes you reevaluate how you watch films.
And Mulvey's work was crucial in paving the way for filmmakers to challenge those conventions and create new ways of representing women on screen.
And what about Teresa de Lauretis? What was her take?
Well, she takes a more constructive approach. She argued for creating new cinematic languages that center the female perspective. Instead of just critiquing the existing system, she wanted to build something new, something that accurately reflects the complexities of female experience.
I love that. It's about going beyond criticism to create something truly groundbreaking and empowering.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming the narrative.
So we've got these feminist film theorists providing the tools to analyze how gender is portrayed on screen.
Yes.
And then this wave of women filmmakers influenced by these ideas who are determined to change the game.
Right.
Powerful combination.
It really is. And it's essential for us as viewers to be aware of these different theoretical frameworks. They give us a whole new way of seeing and understanding the films we watch.
Before we move on, I think it's important to define a few key concepts that the sources emphasize.
Okay, sure.
Representation, image, and stereotype.
Yes. Those terms are really crucial for understanding how media, including film, shapes our perceptions of the world.
So let's start with representation. What does that really mean?
It's about how identities are constructed through media. Who is shown on screen, how are they portrayed, and what messages do those portrayals send to the audience?
And that's where stereotypes come in, right? Representation isn't always accurate or fair.
Exactly. Stereotypes are those oversimplified, often negative beliefs we have about groups of people, and media can either reinforce those stereotypes or challenge them.
So by being aware of how representation works, we can start to question what we're seeing.
Right, and whether it's perpetuating harmful ideas.
You got it. It's about being media literate, understanding the power of images and the messages they convey.
Exactly. It's like becoming a detective, looking for clues about how the world is being represented and whose voices are being heard or silenced.
And that brings us to image. What's the difference between an image and a representation?
Think of an image as a snapshot, a visual representation of an idea, but it doesn't always capture the full meaning or complexity of that idea.
So an image is like a starting point. It's up to us to think critically about what it's really saying.
Right. It's about moving beyond passive watching to active engagement with the media we consume.
These concepts are so powerful for analyzing not just film, but all forms of media. It's like having a whole new set of glasses to see the world with.
I love that analogy, and I think it becomes even more important as we delve into the impact of representation and how it can actually influence social attitudes and behaviors.
The sources bring up Clark's model, which outlines different stages of minority representation in media.
Yeah, Clark's model, that's a useful tool for understanding how perceptions of a group can evolve over time.
Okay, I'm ready. Walk us through those stages.
The first stage is what Clark calls non-representation or symbolic annihilation. It's the complete absence of a group from media.
Like they don't even exist.
Right. And even when a group does start to appear, it's not always in a positive light. The next stage is ridicule.
Okay.
So they're there, but they're being mocked or dismissed, oft through humor that punches down.
Got it.
Then we move on to the regulation stage. Here, a group might be shown in positions of authority, but they're ultimately upholding the existing social order. They're not rocking the boat.
So they're included, but on the terms of the dominant group.
Right. And finally, we arrive at the respect stage where we see accurate and non-stereotypical representation. The group is portrayed in a way that acknowledges their diversity, their complexities, and their full humanity.
So where does Israeli cinema fall within these stages when it comes to depicting women?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's what we'll unpack as we continue our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive.
You left us hanging. Where does Israeli cinema land on Clark's model? Have they reached respect?
It's not a simple answer, is it? You see, Clark's model, it's not like climbing a ladder, it's more like a spectrum. And Israeli cinema, like any national cinema, well, it's got a lot of variety.
So different films are at different points depending on the director, the genre, maybe the time period.
Exactly. Remember those early films, the ones focused on the masculine nation-building narrative?
Yeah.
Well, you could argue those are somewhere between non-representation and regulation when it comes to women.
Because women were there, but often in roles that reinforce those traditional ideas about gender.
Right. It wasn't really until the new wave in the 70s that you start seeing more nuanced portrayals of women. Think about films like I Love You, Rosa, or On a Tightrope. Those filmmakers were pushing boundaries and challenging those earlier stereotypes.
So they inched closer to the respect stage.
I'd say so, a significant step in the right direction. But progress, it's not always a straight line, Even as Israeli cinema became more diverse and experimental, there were still films that fell back on, well, those outdated tropes about women.
It's like any societal shift. There are always going to be those who resist change, who cling to those familiar ideas, even if they're harmful.
Yeah, and we have to think about genre, too. Comedies, for example, they often rely on exaggerated characters and situations that can sometimes lead to reinforcing stereotypes, even if it's not intentional.
So genre, social attitudes, it's all part of this complex picture. What about the rise of women filmmakers? That had to have a big impact.
Oh, it was huge. A total game changer. These women directors brought fresh perspectives, challenged old narratives, and created films that, well, they centered women's experiences in ways we hadn't seen before.
So was that when Israeli cinema really started getting closer to that respect stage for women?
It definitely moved the needle.
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing process, something we need to keep questioning and challenging.
This isn't just an Israeli issue, though, is it? This whole conversation about representation. It's happening everywhere.
Absolutely. The push for more diverse and inclusive representation, it's global. It's really fascinating to see how different cultures are dealing with these questions, in their own unique ways.
That's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're not just talking about movies, right? We're talking about how a culture sees itself, how it defines gender roles, and how it deals with social change.
Exactly. Cinema, it can be a powerful tool for reflection, for understanding who we are and who we want to become. And as Israeli society continues to evolve, I'm excited to see how its cinema will keep reflecting those changes.
Me too. It's like watching a story unfold. Speaking of stories, how about we dive into some specific examples? Some Israeli films that show the themes we've been talking about.
Let's do it. It's time to see how those theoretical concepts actually play out on screen. Where should we start?
Well, we've mentioned Michael Bat-Adam a few times. She was such a pioneer. I'd love to hear more about one of her films.
Great choice. Her 1980 film, On a Tightrope, is a perfect example of how Israeli cinema started to move toward those more complex portrayals of women.
Tell me more. What's it about? Who are the characters?
Well, On a Tightrope, tells the story of this group of young women living in a kibbutz.
Right.
That's a communal agricultural settlement,
Right.
in the late 1950s. And the main character, Yale, she's this rebellious spirit. She questions the kibbutz's strict social rules, and she wants something more than what's expected of women.
So right away, it challenges those earlier Israeli narratives, the ones that, put the Sabra front and center and pushed women's perspectives aside.
Right. Bad Adam turns the camera on the people who don't fit the mold, those trying to find their place in a society with very fixed ideas about women.
I see. How does Bad Adam use, the actual filmmaking to get these themes across? Are there any specific scenes or images that really stand out?
One of the most striking things is the way she uses long takes and close-ups. They create this incredible sense of intimacy and allow the audience to really, connect with the emotions of the characters.
I can picture those close-ups. On Yale's face, as she's thinking about her doubts and desires. Must be really powerful.
It is. And Bad Adam also uses symbolism, The tightrope in the title, it's this recurring motif. It represents that balance, that these women are trying to maintain between tradition and modernity and what's expected of them versus their own aspirations.
It's amazing how such a simple image can be so powerful, how much meaning it can have.
And the setting of the film, the kibbutz, it's significant too. You see, the kibbutz movement, it was founded on these ideals of equality and shared labor. But the reality was, for many women, they were still often confined to those traditional roles.
So the film is using the smaller story, the kibbutz, to explore these bigger issues about gender and power in society.
Exactly, and it does it so subtly, almost subversively. It makes the audience question things, and think about the challenges that women faced in this rapidly changing society.
On a tightrope sounds fascinating. It's such a clear example of how Israeli cinema started to change. Those more nuanced portrayals of women in those decades.
It paved the way for a whole new generation of filmmakers. They could continue pushing those boundaries, exploring different genres, and telling stories from a wider range of perspectives.
So for our next film, let's jump ahead a few decades to a more recent film, maybe one that deals with different challenges.
Okay, how about Karen Yedaya's, or My Treasure, from 2004. It deals with some difficult subjects, but with incredible sensitivity.
This is the one that won at Cannes, right?
Yes, the Cannes d'Or. And its success internationally just shows how much it resonates, beyond Israel. It touches on these universal themes: poverty, exploitation, and the resilience of the human spirit.
Okay, tell me more. What's the story behind Or? What makes it so powerful?
It focuses on the relationship between a mother, Ruthie, and her daughter, Or, who's 12. They live in a rundown apartment building in Tel Aviv, just struggling to survive.
So right away, we're moving away from those idealized images of Israel, the ones that dominated earlier cinema.
Absolutely. Yedaya's film, it doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of poverty and the challenges faced by, those marginalized communities, the ones that are often overlooked.
And the mother, Ruthie, she's a sex worker, right? That's something you don't see explored very often in film, at least not from a woman's perspective.
Right. And Yedaya, she doesn't try to sugarcoat it, but she portrays her with dignity, showing the hard choices she makes to survive and take care of her daughter.
So it's going beyond those, simplistic, judgmental portrayals we often see.
Exactly. Or humanizes Ruthie. It shows her as a real person with hopes and dreams. Just like anyone else.
And it's really about the relationship between her and her daughter, right?
Yes. Or is this bright, observant child who's had to grow up too fast. She loves her mother, but she also has to deal with the realities of her mother's profession.
Sounds like a coming-of-age story, you know, but set against poverty and social marginalization.
You could say that. And the film's title, Or, which means light in Hebrew, it's important. Because despite all the darkness, both Ruthie and Or, they have this inner strength, this, glimmer of hope that comes through.
That's a beautiful image. It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit even when things are tough.
And the ending, although it's ambiguous, it suggests that there's a possibility of redemption, like a light at the end of the tunnel.
I can see why this film has resonated with so many people. It's a story that needs to be told, a reminder that even in a society that values social justice, there are people who fall through the cracks.
And it shows the power of women filmmakers to bring those voices to the forefront, to make us question our perceptions and broaden our understanding.
On a tightrope and Or, they give us a glimpse into Israeli cinema, and how it's changed over time.
And as we move to the last part of our deep dive, it's important to think about what these films tell us about Israel as a whole. How do those individual stories connect to the larger story of the nation?
Yeah. We've talked about theory, analyzed films, but what does it all mean? What are the key takeaways for our listener?
We'll get into all that in part 3.
Back again for part 3 of our deep dive.
We've come a long way, tracing how women have been portrayed in Israeli cinema.
It really has been quite a journey.
Some of those early films, with that very specific image of what it meant to be a woman in Israel, to the more nuanced and complex characters we're seeing on screen today.
Yeah, really fascinating to see how things have changed alongside Israeli society itself.
Yeah.
The politics and the culture.
Exactly. So in this final part, what are the big takeaways here? How do these films, help us make sense of how Israel's identity has evolved? Well, one thing that really stands out is how Israeli cinema, especially since the 70s, it really started to reflect the country's own growing complexity. Those early films, they often had this sense of unity, this focus on national identity.
Yeah, that we're all in this together kind of feeling.
Right, exactly. But as Israel matured, so did its cinema. Filmmakers began to explore, the tensions within Israeli society, class differences, religious divides, even just the complexities of identity.
And it's as we see there's more diverse representations of women, right?
Exactly. Characters grappling with those tensions, not just fitting into neat little boxes. Think about the films we talked about On a Tightrope or My Treasure.
Yeah.
They don't shy away from those difficult realities.
It's like cinema became this mirror, showing both the good and the bad. It really forced people to have a conversation about what it means to be Israeli in all its, messiness.
Right. And don't forget the impact of women filmmakers, too. They brought their own unique experiences to the table, and they challenged those male-dominated narratives that, had shaped so much of how stories were told.
It wasn't just about adding more women on screen, was it?
No, not at all. It was about changing how women are seen, how they're understood.
Giving a voice to those who hadn't really been heard before.
Exactly.
So, Israeli cinema, it's come a long way. If we had to sum it all up, what are the key insights here? What should our listener take away from all of this?
I'd say the most important thing is that, how women are portrayed in Israeli cinema, it's a process. It's always changing, along with the country itself.
It's a story that's still being written. Each new film adds another chapter.
And we can't forget the crucial role that women filmmakers have played, They've challenged the status quo, brought fresh perspectives, and they've really enriched the conversation.
Absolutely. And their work, it's not just about Israeli cinema. It's part of this bigger global discussion about representation and diversity.
Exactly.
About the power of storytelling, how it can really shape how we see the world.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. Now that you've seen these different lenses, these tools for understanding representation, think about how they might change how you watch films, not just from Israel, but from everywhere.
It's like you've given us this new key to unlock deeper meaning in every film.
Exactly. Because cinema, at its best, it's more than just entertainment, isn't it? It's a reflection of who we are, our struggles, our triumphs, and how we see the world.
And on that note, we'll let you continue exploring. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.